Welcome to part 4 of Tao, the Way of Nature, the full return to nature, and we will be talking a lot more about all the many subjects to help us find peace and balance within our lives. And part of that process is developing trust. Trusting the world allows you to become part of it, not against it. This is learning how to leave things alone, get a direct experience. Philosophy sounds good, but it is not reality. Again, the words that we create, the categories, the titles, the judgments, this is not reality. So trust who you are deep down inside. This may be seen as the only meaning in life. This is unconditional honesty, love, and friendship to others, ourselves, and the world. Instead of being judgmental, being a friend. Even the worst of people are among us, a brother or sister. And this reminds me of the quote by the famous American slavery abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. He says, "The country is our world. Our countrymen are all mankind." He had to recognize that for his cause to end slavery because he realized that it doesn't matter what people thought of slaves. It's unnatural for anybody to be a slave. They wouldn't want it done to them personally. Why would they allow it to be done to others? It violates the golden rule, the law of love, they called it. And they used moral suasion to say, you know what? We deserve to be free. Everybody deserves to be free. Because we're all equal. It says so in the Declaration of Independence unless we're contradicting ourselves. That's why he publicly burned the Constitution in front of others. He caused a bit of controversy, but in a non-violent way, just to educate the world about the fact that we all are among each other and have to trust those who we think are inferior. We can empower them. We can help them. If you want someone to become better, you can't not trust them and be fearful of them. It's not going to help their condition. You empower them. You trust them. Like a kid that you're bringing into the world. You don't fear the kid is going to go crazy. You love the kid and you want to help them. And because of your love, they love you. Right? So if a kid is growing, realize they are a kid. And they will be a kid. So if you see they're doing a bunch of things that are like too playful for you, too chaotic, realize they're just a kid. We do not need to culture kids. They just want to have fun. They want to let go. They want to practice Wu Wei, perhaps more than adults in some sense of being able to let go. And we should admire that in kids and nurture that. Yes, there's its limits, right? In the sense of, okay, you're playing too much here and you're making other people upset or things like of that matter. But we realize they're kids. They want to have fun. There's a reason why they want to explore the world, why they have mystery. And we realize by understanding the Tao that mystery is so essential for our learning. And kids, we want them to learn. So if we want them to be creative, which they also have the great ability to do, then we would nurture that. We would trust it. We would allow it. We would recognize it as actually important. And maybe we would help that in the fact that we give them coloring books or we allow them to explore nature with us, right? And we trust ourselves to go with them, to have fun with them. We trust ourselves to go about every day, drive cars and take risks every day. We don't think of every little risk that we take, but there's hundreds of risks we take all the time. And so this matter of trust and unconditional honesty or love, well, I wrote a book about radical honesty. This is not to plug the book, but needless to say, I find it very, very helpful. And you can see on the left, there's a very popular book by Brad Blanton, PhD, called Radical Honesty. And the name of my book is Nature's Radical Honesty, a practical application of naturosophy, a philosophy that I developed. I'll talk about that a little bit later as to why I did that, because I found value in Daoism and other philosophies that also studied nature and merely just emphasizing our respect to the universe and to ourselves. And if we truly care about ourselves deep down inside, we will always be honest with ourselves or to others, or try to be honest to the universe in achieving what the universe wants of us, in a sense. Okay, so doing what is right and not doing what is wrong. Knowing what is right and sticking by that principle because you know it. You have to be honest with yourself. Unless you're going to lie and you're going to allow wrongdoing, or you're going to create confusion because you're not telling people the truth and you're deceiving them. So honesty is a very, very important topic for you to share these two resources. So, wonders of a weed. We criticize weeds. We say weeds are not good for the garden. They need to be taken out. But, actually, I have a picture here on the bottom of the slide of a dandelion, because although it's considered a weed and a lot of people would cut it down, the whole thing is edible. And there's countries that make salads out of it, and there's people who make soups out of it, and there's people who make tea out of it because it's detoxifying and it's very healthy for the human body in many ways. So is it really a weed in that case? Something we should just cut down and ignore and say is problematic for the world? Is there anything in this world that is just problematic that we should just get rid of? Because I guarantee you, even the things you consider wrong, again, teach us of what is right. They help us see the value in life. They give us a sense of purpose. And so here's a quote from Alan Watts. You notice a small weed growing underneath a hedge. And this weed is really, after all, not just to be dismissed as a weed, but some rather lovely design that is in the nature of this plant. Or supposing you are bothered by financial uproar, wars, politics, and everything like that, and you are sitting on a beach, and you become aware of the water endlessly crossing pebbles, and you get a sense that this goes on forever and ever and ever. It is long before you were thought of, long before all human history, empires, schemes, and so on, and will endure long after. But it's something that strikes you that is very simple, very ordinary, like the water on the pebbles, or like the little weed under the hedge, that suggests a kind of amazing eternal reliability of nature. So in the sense of understanding that nature has always been here, and we can just trust the processes of this life, and that of all the things that have happened in history and all the things we think are happening now that are disastrous, they've happened before, and humans have gotten past it. We should not worry, because our worries can make matters even worse, actually. As we talked about before, and being able to work from the blank slate, being able to see our original selves, so we can think clearly and rationally. And so there's simplicity in life that we found out we should understand from looking at no thingness, looking at the uncarved block, or the still point in Taoism. And so here's another quote from Alan Watts. He says, in Buddhism, one would not say so much poverty as one would say simplicity. Not going without, not clinging to things because it's good for you, but because it is actually the happiest way to live. Because nothing is more terrifying than the state of chronic anxiety which one has if you are subject to the illusion that something in life could be held onto and safeguarded, and nothing can. So the acceptance of everything flowing away is absolutely basic to freedom, to being an unsi, a cloud water person who drifts like cloud and flows like water. So tying in both the ideas of riding the wind like Lao Tzu and flowing like water like the Tao. These two are very correlated, one and the same here, and I might have said unsui wrong. I don't know how to say that word. Alan Watts is very proficient in many Eastern philosophies. And so he's able to look at Buddhism and Taoism and learn from all of them to see that there's this underlying simplicity that all of them were basically teaching. That we don't view life in terms of numbers or symbols and who has more or less of this and that. No. It's more about just living life to begin with. And you're able to be more conscious when you have less distractions, when you have greater simplicity. So you can be more among the flow of life that just goes as things are. And so, this being said, and we talked about before about the uncarved block and being able to return to our original state, past a lot of the thoughts in our head, and being able to not let the world get to us, we do have to be aware of something. We have to be wary of the extreme, right? Remember we talked about asceticism as like an extreme of not eating, like an extreme simplicity. Well, there's this concept of the stone Buddha that Alan Watts talks about. He says, a person with no emotions, who has completely controlled his emotions, is a stone Buddha. So a person who would completely let go would also be some kind of inanimate object. And so, to be perfectly human, one must not have a state of absolute detachment, but a state of detachment which contains a little bit of resistance. Again, Taoism does not mean no resistance. It means being able to flow. So a certain clinging still, the great yogi, maybe he smokes a cigarette or has a bad temper occasionally, something that keeps him human. And I certainly have that too. I've been able to be more present and look less upon my past because my mind likes to go to the past. Many times because of my great memories and seeing the better world perhaps that I see as better. But the world is still here and nature is relatively the same, just human matters are changing. And so I'm basically stuck in my own head. And so if I think about it a little bit sometimes, I go to the past, I get sad, I get a little emotional. But that's because I'm human. I'm going to. Although, most of the time, I've been able to control it quite well because of the Taoist practices. Being able to meditate, quiet my mind, and remember how life changes. Remember this flow of life. So my philosophy, my knowledge is aligned to my presence. And again, but they both give way to another. And so we recognize why we would meditate, and we meditate to know more in the first place. And that's a beauty in life. Like you learn from this presentation in order to become more still, to become more present. And that helps you then learn more knowledge in response, right? It's a giving and getting situation. It's integrative. It's holistic. And so that little thing, Alan Watts says, is very important, is having that human touch to our lives. And it's like the salt in the stew, he says, having those little things that ground us, like those things that might be undesirable according to other people, right? And they are simply just the thing that makes you you to some extent too. This is another great way of saying that even a very great sage, a great Buddha, will have in him a touch of regret that life is fleeting, because if he doesn't have that touch of regret, he's not human, and he's incapable of compassion towards people who regret very much that life is fleeting. So he's not in an extreme, he's just having a little bit of that spice in his life. Because when you cook food, you just add a little bit of spice. You don't add a bunch of spice, you're going to be burning hot, going crazy, right? And then you're going to be running for milk, you're going to be running for trying to get some help. Your senses are going to go crazy, your digestion's going to go crazy. Other people might go crazy. And instead, if you have just a perfect amount of spice, you might actually be able to ground yourself a little bit and just open up the senses just enough, but not to the point of, oh my gosh, this is extreme. Just to use a little bit of a cooking analogy, in case that helps. But to say that it's okay if you have some sin that some people would refer to, or vices, right? We just want to make sure that we have temperance to keep those vices under control, to realize that we're conscious of those, that we are responsible, able to respond to what happens in our environment, including ourselves, because we are a part of that environment. And so people ask themselves, well, how do I find paradise? We talked about before about how people can find happiness, less about finding, more about embracing. Well, Alan Watts tells us here, the real thing that you are is the paradise land that you're looking for at the end of the line. And it's far, far more reliable than any kind of an external scene which you could love and cling to and hold on to. So the real thing that you are is the paradise land that you're looking for. There is a price to be paid for every increase in consciousness. We cannot be more sensitive to pleasure without being more sensitive to pain. And so this is just another addition to understand that, you have to embrace this life. There's always going to be downsides. You can think that you're going to find some paradise, People go on vacation, they have to go back to work. Oh man, it doesn't last forever. They go to Florida like I do. Oh, you think it's all paradise. There's palm trees and beaches. No, the real world still catches up with you. Real world. But still, you have to realize that problems you're going to run into, they are inevitable. And so if you want to be happy, if you want to find paradise, it's in learning how to deal with that inevitable and learning how to embrace those changes and see the silver lining in those clouds. So you aren't consumed by the darkness and don't just think, well, there's no hope because there's always bad things. No, there is always hope because there is always bad things. It means there's also always good things. Because that's why we recognize them as bad. That's why, we have those experiences in the first place. They're simply reactions to the actions that we partake in. And so, if we look at this holistic worldview of life, we can look at vinegar taste. This is a story that is shared. I think I also heard of this from George Thompson, sharing it in one of his videos. It's a Chinese philosophical story about Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu, each tasting vinegar. Confucius tasted sourness. The world was sour. Humankind was full of corruption and out of alignment. What was needed was rules and rituals. Okay, so he's like, man, society, we don't got things figured out. We need more rules, more rituals. We need to make sure more order can manifest. And fair enough, you can understand where he's coming from. He sees there's chaos and that there's order that needs to be then created in a response. And you'll see that's a common pattern among these three individuals, but they each have a different way of handling it. And so Buddha tasted bitterness on the vinegar. Life was bitter due to humankind's desires and attachments, leading to suffering. So happiness could only be found in leaving the world, entering nirvana, meditation purely, being able to completely detach. This is the Buddhist teachings in a nutshell. And so rather than Confucius, who says we need more rules and rituals, Buddha is like, well, we need to leave the world in a sense, find our detachment. Now, it's not to say we don't learn from these two folks, but what does Lao Tzu have to say about this? Well, he actually smiles when he tastes the vinegar. He saw bitterness and sourness, both from Confucius' point of view and Buddha's point of view, as coming from an unappreciative and inattentive mind. Because nature itself, he saw, is not sour or bitter. If we seek to harmonize with nature, it's about seeing this. That life is a mirror, and if you smile at it, it smiles at you. And so, if it's bitter or sour, it's just part of the experience of life, and if everybody has different tastes of that life too, well then that's just also part of life. It emphasizes the uniqueness of individuals. But if we're going to look at the world so wrongly, what are we going to do about it? We're going to try to leave it or try to alter it? Lao Tzu says, no, let's learn to live with it. It's reality. Why fight reality? Life is a mirror. If you smile at it, it smiles at you. Many people might have called this the law of attraction, okay? And again, the golden rule, sort of do unto others what you want done unto you. Would you want rules and rituals imposed upon you? And is the person who does wrong realize that they're doing wrong? Are they trying to do right in their own regard? The person who wants to leave the world, why do they want to leave it so bad? What's going on, right? We have to ask these questions, and Lao Tzu, I think, helps us see a bigger picture past the bitterness or sourness, because these are just merely tastes of a world that includes both. And so we're able to see the bigger picture. Why attach ourselves to one idea of what life is, right? And so let me now talk about naturosophy. I mentioned this briefly before. Naturosophy is a philosophy I developed to help us emphasize and unite philosophies, including Daoism, that recognize nature's authority. I developed this on purpose because in the modern world, in a yang world, you would expect many philosophies, not just Daoism, to become apparent for emphasizing nature. Because of our detachment from it, or because we need to learn more from it because of all the chaos or things that we see are not in alignment with it. And merely just to educate people about who they are. You can see that The N and S, which makes up the logo for Naturosophy, can actually be tied into the yin-yang symbol within itself. And I even put an infinity sign as well, because it's actually quite symbolic for what Naturosophy teaches within my works. It's based on the book Sapientia Naturae and its corresponding guidebook. I recommend the guidebook since it's primarily just questions to help an individual learn for themselves. And it's just something to bear in mind because, again, I told you that I came across Taoism quite naturally as part of my journey. So I developed this along the way, and Taoism was part of that process. And so it teaches us, Naturosophy, that we should let the natural come natural. It's to embrace what you know, including knowing the unknown in the case of the yin, not just the yang. And so what is natural to exist is what is natural to persist. If we see something that has always existed and we can continue to live with, we know this is something that helps support us. Okay, it's something perhaps we need. And so time tells us all truth, and time heals all wounds. And just because something naturally occurs does not mean it is natural to exist. And just because something is natural to exist does not mean it is natural to use. And this is understanding essentially time and place. You can use a ventilator to help you breathe. But we should be asking the question of, is the person meant to breathe in the first place? Should they need the ventilator? Because if we say they need it, because of how essential it is, yeah, it's very natural to use in helping someone breathe, but is there something that is more natural than a ventilator? Well, it's the person breathing for themselves. And so we should ask the question of, why do we need the ventilator? Why do we assume this is part of nature then? If we say it's needed, if we say we can't live without it. Clearly, there's been times before we lived without it, so what did we do then? You know? Oh, well, we didn't have a ventilator, so they died. Well, there might have been other strategies, number one, and number two, we need to understand why they died. But we need to understand that we can prevent, not just treat, health conditions. And that the body is teaching us. It's teaching us way more than we may see if we're just looking at treatment and we're not looking at prevention. Because prevention would tell us that something is wrong that we're not looking at. The problem is this person isn't breathing. Well, there might be a deeper problem. They might have pneumonia, they might have a bunch of lung conditions. Well, how did that happen, right? We wouldn't ask that question if we didn't want to get more preventative and find out the root cause to the problem. And so there's a common quote shared in Naturosophy, and it's that there is only one good knowledge and one evil ignorance, but yet we also know that we know nothing. And these are two quotes particularly from Socrates. And so Lao Tzu tells us, similar to this, that the more you know, the less you understand. So you can sort of connect these two ideas. And nature is good or natural in Naturosophy insofar as it is known. And knowing more does require seeking the hidden, seeing what you do not know. That's how you acquire more knowledge, and therefore we always keep learning, as we mentioned before. And through the lens of understanding nature and seeing it as good, morality is then naturality. We're not stuck on man-made standards of right and wrong, but rather looking at humans being aligned to nature overall as being this great standard. And so nature can be correlated to that of health or right or correct or real. So just as one would say they would want to do something that is real for reality, somebody would want to do something natural for nature. And Alan Watts tells us, just as true humor is laughter at oneself, true humanity is knowledge of oneself. And you can say, know thyself. It's a very popular quote as well, telling us this great thing that we have, knowledge, although again we can see that there's dangers with it too, and there's ways we can attain knowledge which involves not so much seeking it out. That knowledge we can have of ourselves more than others because we're trying to figure out the world around us and try to figure out others, but this is the only home we live in, right? So just bear that in mind. This is body you're in control of. So you might be able to know more of yourself than anybody else on this earth. So that's why another reason not so much to judge others. And again, not even to judge yourself because we're still figuring it out ourselves. But in naturosophy, what is naturalizing, or what is natural or right, is for naturalization. In the real sense, not naturalization as in becoming a citizen of a country, but as in becoming natural as part of nature, so becoming naturalized. Okay? Naturalize, to make natural. That's what it means when you break down the word. And whereas the opposing side to naturalizing would be denaturing, which is the unnatural or wrong for denaturalization. So taking ourselves out of nature and putting ourselves into man-made illusions and standards and accepting that as our reality rather than reality itself. And so humans can only attempt to violate or force nature, but we will only delay or distract from the inevitable, since it's by the very nature of illusion that it is not real. That we think something is real when in reality it isn't. And only reality can tell us what is reality. So being able to escape the illusion, you can go back to the idea of honesty. We can start with recognizing we've been lied to or we've been lying to ourselves, and that then we should start being more honest with ourselves. And that's how we become more honest overall. You know, it's starting to do our best and then ever striving to do our best. Continually doing more and more to, it can be in many ways doing less, becoming who we are meant to be. And that can be the uncarved block, the still point, meditation. It could be reflection techniques. It could be asking ourselves questions. It could be simply making better choices in our lives from that. So that way we can better work with our own body, our own digestion, and the world around us. And so this process you may call natural learning. Within Sapientia Naturae, there are chapters. There's one on natural leadership. Leadership is talked a lot about in the Tao, very similarly. There's ones about natural profession and finding what is your purpose in this life? Like, what are you trying to do? Is it really to make money? Or is it, again, the things that you want money for? And do we seek that out directly? Can we attain it now, even without money? And natural learning, maybe we don't have to go through a school system necessarily. We talked before about unschooling. We talked about how we can learn more by not necessarily desiring it and having the embrace of mystery. And so we can obtain wisdom without books or research. We can perceive the world and learn about the world from the slightest of things, especially that in nature, which is at the root to everything. And wisdom from wide means vision. Okay, the word wisdom comes from vision. So do you use your own eyes? Another way you could look at it is realization, real eyes. Right, my friend, Realization, that's actually the name of his channel, great content. But you live in the same reality as philosophers, teachers, and others who have reached conclusions which you can reach in different ways. This is why we see many different cultures around the world sharing similar ideas. And that's why I created Naturosophy, which again did not really have the intent of embracing Taoism or Transcendentalism or Stoicism and seeing the parallels between these, or even abolitionism. And so there are parallels. We can actually see them here on this slide. And so here's an example from Black Elk, the Lakota people. They say, at the center of the universe dwells the Great Spirit. That center is really everywhere. It is within each of us. And then here's a quote from Zhuangzi in Daoism. Do not ask whether intelligence is in this or in that. It is in all beings. And then from Jesus in Christianity, he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Abide in me as I in you. So again, the sense of connectedness and trust in who we naturally are, and seeing this common trend among Great Spirit and Inner Light and Tao and Anima Mundi, that you don't need to attach yourself to Taoism, to Buddhism, to Christianity, but you can learn from all these great ideas and see the value therein everything. As Lao Tzu says, being able to see all things, when we really are able to come from the point of view of the uncarved block And therefore, then, we don't really have an agenda. It's hard to fit ourselves into a box. And so there is emptiness in nature. We can see more of reality and appreciate more that comes from it. You may also learn from other animals to observe intelligence that they have to share, as we mentioned before. So take a walk. Naturosophy handles all things, studying nature, and Taoism thereof takes it deeper than mere intellect. It really emphasizes the yin, the parts of us that we don't see about ourselves. I will admit that naturosophy is more of a mental, intellectual exercise, and Taoism may be more aligned to what people call spirituality. And there's nothing wrong with that, because they both have the same intent of aligning to nature, and they both can be grounded in philosophy in many different perspectives, many different worldviews and cultures coming together. I think it's a beautiful thing. So take a walk. Don't be afraid to be your own philosopher like the millions of philosophers that's been there before you, many of which might have also lost their works along the way. I mean, who knows? We've had libraries, the Library of Alexandria in the past, that burned down. I mean, who knows how much knowledge has been lost due to ideology, due to divisions in the world, right? But now you live in the age of mass information and technology where people can literally research anything and put out anything for all to see. It's quite fascinating. I wouldn't put the modern day down so much when you have power that never was there before. The power to educate people, to reach more people than anyone else. I mean, Lao Tzu made more of an impact than me, even though in his day and age he probably knew way less people than me. And so I'm able to reach more people than him now, but his message lives on stronger than mine, perhaps. And interesting, the ideas matter, the message matters, and exactly, nature, in this sense, matters. The truth, reality matters, and so it doesn't matter what title, what label, what ideology you want to string onto it. Let's realize the unifying tie of nature throughout all of it. And so, what is nature, according to the Taoist perspective? Well, it's called Zuran, or Tsujin, okay? Now, there's different ways to say words like this one in Taoism again, but it has to do with Wu Wei as well. And so here's a quote. The expression Zuran, Suzhan, is the term that we translate nature when we translate Chinese. It doesn't say nature or natura, which means, in a way, class of things. It means literally self-so, what is so of itself, what happens of itself, and thus spontaneity. And in the Tao Te Ching, early on, Lao Tzu tells us that the Tao's method is to be so of itself. It means that the more liberty you give, the more love you give, the more you allow things in yourself and in your surroundings to take place, the more order you will have. Alan Watts. So we talked before about a tyrannical ruler versus somebody who basically doesn't appear to be any ruler at all, and how order can manifest on its own. And we even shared a story from the Yellow Emperor, shared by Lao Tzu, where this emperor dreamed of an empire that ruled itself, self-governing. And so it's because he learned how to let go and let the people manage their own lives. And so this all relates to everything that we are talking about, moving on in this presentation, and you can make endless connections, which is the beauty of this work. And so this relates to the uncarved block, being able to see that of which is so of itself, the Zuran. And the uncarved block is also called Pu or Fupu, which also means honesty, reality, or simplicity. And this is also sometimes translated as wholeness, which wholeness, if you look at the Latin word for health, it means whole. And we also talk about dis-ease as being the opposite of health. Well, the opposite of disease is ease, and ease has a lot to do with flow, letting things go, having simplicity in life. And it makes life much easier for many people. I mean, the goal in life, if I were to ask people, I think they would say, yeah, I want life to be easier, I want life to be better. And so they want life to be better and easier. I think Taoism hits it quite on the nail. Well, the world can self-govern itself. You don't have to worry so much, so it's easy. And at the same time, it's governing itself, so it's working out great. And so this type of simplicity, but really just naturalness, is this Zuran that we're talking about. And the connection in naturosophy that nature is also health is seen here when you see that the uncarved block, which is also referred to as the Tao, can be translated as wholeness. So beautiful connections that could be made. When we see the connections of life, most importantly, our connection to life itself, we may have tranquility. Again, we see peace, balance. Here's a quote from Zhuangzi. The men of old, while the chaotic condition was yet undeveloped, shared the placid tranquility which belonged to the whole world. At that time, the yin and yang were harmonious and still. Their resting and movement proceeded without any disturbance. The 4 seasons had their definite times. Not a single thing received any injury, and no living being came to a premature end. Men might be possessed of the faculty of knowledge, but they had no occasion for its use. This was what is called the state of perfect unity. At this time, there was no action on the part of anyone, but a constant manifestation of spontaneity. So Zhuangzi is giving us a depiction of the harmonious nature with our harmonious nature aligned to it, which again, we are just part of nature. So we being part of nature, I'm just going to call nature in the sense of wholeness, in the sense that we are part of that spontaneity, that we are so united with nature that we don't even need to think about it. We don't need to question the things that might be endlessly questioned in the modern day that have never been questioned before because we're so stuck in our heads. We are just living life so naturally that it's no question what is natural and what is unnatural. It's reality. That's not to say that it's wrong to question that. Anybody can question anything in this life. It seems like there's no disturbance, there's no chaos. Maybe it's because people are letting things be more often. I don't know, you tell me your interpretation of this quote. A time where things are harmonious and there's less disturbance in the world. The men of old he talks about. What is he talking about in particular when he talks about this? And we're going to see this as a common trend as well, talking about how there was times of peace, or how we dream of a world where there can be peace because we know it's possible, given the Tao and what humans can do with it. Again, it's already there. It's the matter of question as to if we will align to it and allow and embrace what simply is. And so nature and Tao is forever for you. It will always be there for you. This is something to just bear in mind, to realize you're never really alone. You may call yourself lonely because there's no other people, but you're not alone in the sense that you always have nature. The trees will always give you oxygen. It does not judge you. Only by your own actions it does, through consequences. But nature only has yet to be understood and allowed to be harmonized with. It is there for you. This is why we chop down trees and use it to build houses. But if we don't recognize the power of trees to begin with, we might cut down all the trees and then we don't realize they can give us oxygen as well. And they give us things that are really, really natural for us, that we disregarded because of our own man-made creations. And our own mind got in our own way of our own alignment to our own world. And so we live in contradiction. And we don't want to live in contradiction. We want to live in unification, right? And mastery. Becoming the masters of ourselves, of the universe. But in the sense of really aligning to it. We'll be talking about this idea of mastery and masters. And so when we talk about nature and what is good, what may be perceived is an appeal to nature fallacy in philosophy. There is a relatively common logical fallacy accepted within the study of modern philosophy, known as the appeal to nature fallacy. It is assumed that Taoism or naturosophy makes this logical fallacy. However, the natural is specifically defined in both cases. So I made a chart where you can see the appeal to nature fallacy is this basic equation, okay? And you basically fill in the words. That which is natural is good. N is natural, therefore N is good or right. And usually they're referring to, okay, I walk into a superstore or I see something that's labeled natural and I assume it's better. Well, from that point of view, if you don't know what is actually natural, yeah, it's quite fallacious in the sense that there's no knowledge behind what you're doing. You don't know what is natural and therefore you can't really say if it's good, right? But if you can define these terms, maybe that will really help us understand. And in Taoism and naturosophy, these terms are defined. And so let's just use the words that we learned, Wu Wei and Zerand, and apply it into the equation. So if we first use Taoism, that which is natural, or Zerand, or without effort, Wu Wei, is virtuous, which is what we would consider to be good. That would be T or D. Again, that's the Chinese word for virtue. And so N, abiding by the nature of nature, is natural or without effort. And therefore, N is virtuous, it's T or D. Look at this chart for yourself, okay, because me describing it might be a little bit more difficult. But essentially, if something is effortless, if it's natural by the nature of things, then it is virtuous, according to Taoism. Now, to provide another perspective on this, using naturosophy, that which is natural or forever existent, again, Zerand, or naturalizing, supports the natural, again, Wu Wei. It is moral, good, honest, healthy, right, real, etc. There's many words that represent a similar standard. And so N, abiding by the nature of nature, with our knowledge of existence, occurrence, and usage, is natural. And therefore, N is moral, good, honest, healthy, right, real, etc. And so we learn what to do and what not to do in this life, essentially. We learn what helps our nature versus what doesn't. We learn what is forever existent versus what isn't. We learn what allows us to be effortless versus what creates so much resistance that the universe clearly doesn't want us to be taking a certain path in this life. And again, we can get stuck on those paths that we see are providing so much resistance. And that's where we need to practice more of the Wu Wei and the Zerand, and realize that if we want to align back to nature, it takes a process of learning Taoism or naturosophy alike, and making this appeal to nature with knowledge, not just assuming, oh, well, it says it's natural, therefore it's good. No. There's clearly a foundation here. The whole presentation is that foundation to understanding what is Wu Wei. And it has a basis in nature because everywhere you look in nature, things are growing spontaneously with synchronicity, with this Wu Wei. And it's just a matter of time for humans to recognize that they too are part of nature and can do the same thing. And there are humans who practice it now, because you can practice it now. So it's not like something you have to wait on. It's just a matter of time for the whole world to do that. And we don't need to wait for the whole world, right? We can apply it directly in our lives now and see the virtue that we get as a response. And of course, we'll talk more about T or D, or what is virtuous. But to help us understand more of this idea of the real appeal to nature, or naturosophy, natural learning, and what is nature, Jason Gregory has a great video talking about the natural human being. And so he breaks it down with talking about virtue, and as well as Li, which is our organic pattern. He says to seek refuge from these unnatural systems, we need to understand nature itself. The organic pattern of the individual, or Li, is our innate nature driven by Ti, or virtue. Nature, then, has no relationship to force, control, or power. The order and pattern of nature is not a forced order, as nature is not bound by external influence or control. The Taoist term for nature is the Chinese Zuran or Shuchuan, which means that which is spontaneously of itself. When a natural organism is in harmony with all life, it grows of itself spontaneously. Shuchuan can only arise of itself without external compulsion. What would happen if we let go of control? What if we left the animal, plant, and mineral kingdoms alone? They continue to grow without any interference. What then if we left people alone? People would follow their natures, because passive obedience would no longer be a way of life. We would no longer feel the need to obey unnatural organizational patterns, because in following our own nature, we would begin to harmonize with other people and the environment. When we leave life alone, Tao runs its natural course, and all aspects of life come into order without seeking order. So this summarizes the whole idea of harmonizing with nature from the Taoist perspective. If you want more, I recommend watching that video. It's by far, if not my most favorite video on Taoism on the entire internet. And maybe I'm just a little bit biased because Jason has a very outright approach to it, and I love his editing skills and everything that he does. But I really just love the title of the video. I love the message. I love how he brings everything together in this one video. So maybe I'm biased, but I love it. Great job, Jason. But there's this interdependency, and Alan Watts talks about it too. He says there's always the idea of the king and the ruler attached in most spiritual philosophies, but not in the Chinese Tao philosophy. The Tao is not something different from nature, from ourselves, from our surrounding trees and waters and air. The Tao is the way all that behaves, and so the basic Chinese idea of the universe is really that it's an organism. Everything operating together so that nowhere can you find the controlling center. There isn't any. The world is a system of interrelated components, none of which can survive without each other. Just as in the case of bees and flowers, you will never find bees around in a place where there aren't flowers, and you will never find flowers around in a place where there aren't bees or insects that do the equivalent job. And what that tells us secretly is that although bees and flowers look different from each other, they're inseparable. They arise mutually. There's no cause and effect. It's not that relationship at all. It's like the egg and the hen. So as the bees and the flowers coexist in the same way as high and low, back and front, long and short, loud and soft, all those experiences are experienceable only in terms of their polar experience. So the Chinese idea of nature is that all the various species arise mutually because they interdepend. And this total system of interdependence is the Tao. Wonderful quote, I find. This is like talking about the origin of the universe to some extent, right? And again, Lao Tzu puts it simply in poetic terms. But the interdependency in life, which again, we see the yin and the yang working together, and how if one becomes extreme, it's not like the other one just goes away. There's always the seed of the yin and the yang, or the yang and the yin. And so there's this interdependency always at play. And so I find that so fascinating, so beautiful to recognize that we cannot put ourselves into one box, because there's a reason why there are so many different types of boxes per se. There's a reason why there's so many philosophies and religions. They all give rise to each other, right? It's a beautiful thing. It's not something that we should abhor, but I think it's also the matter of, are we willing to accept that and not say, well, mine is the only way and you must live with it. Accept the fact that people think different, that people are different, and that nature has difference. That is what we're talking about as part of this interdependency. And so we have this true mastery to obtain. Quote, the master can act without doing anything and teach without saying a word. Things come her way and she does not stop them. Things leave and she lets them go. Lao Tzu. So if you've gotten to this point in this presentation, this should become more understandable. You observe with stillness and you make room, and you don't be restless, you don't react suddenly. You relax, allow insights to arise naturally, and you adapt and you be flexible. And essentially you gain a mastery over your actions as you practice, and it makes perfect into Wu Wei, and you take that path of least resistance and you act consciously. Your cold cognition to your hot cognition, to the point where things become spontaneous. Things are so natural to be. And that is the type of mastery where I have, for a picture on the slide, a painting or a painter who is one with the painting, which is why I said the painting or the painter. This is his creation. It's a part of himself. He became one with the brush and thus became one with the painting. And now he's thus one with the painting because after his time, that painting is there for all of time, right? It's a sense of his essence, his spirit, you may call it. You know, his creative energy, his energy went into that. And so it's sort of like a part of him. I mean, do you have anything that you cherish in your life? A prized possession, a family heirloom that was passed down? Why do you find it important to you? It's because something was tied to it. Some sort of essence or spirit from somebody that you may have lost, or somebody who matters a lot to you, right? And so there's this mastery that we can attain for ourselves so we can create things like they did. So we can become strong, and all these people that we admire and look up to, well, we can be just like them if we set our minds to it. But perhaps it's because we also have to let it go into it naturally. Allow ourselves to flow. And so you can create just as they do. Just as, again, you can be a philosopher just as the philosophers of the past. You can be a master just among the other masters. There's a reason why every master was once an apprentice. Every pro gamer was once a noob. Just bear that in mind. And next time someone wants to push you down, they were once in your shoes, perhaps. And so there's a level of optimization we all can then reach with understanding our nature and aligning to it. If we're stuck in the house, the easy way is to do stuff in or around the house. If in traffic, you go with the flow. A sailor aware of the wind can sail easier. He's acting intelligently. Again, it's not just the easier way, it's the intelligent way. It's the effortless intelligence. And so we fall asleep by allowing our body to carry us into it. We become creative by providing the right circumstances, but we can't force it. And that is the main conclusion here, is that we cannot force nature. Because those who ride the wave in economics or trends can make a lot of impact. And these are all just examples of how if we go with the flow, life is much easier. But again, it's the flow which is Wu Wei, which is nature, which is the Tao. It's not the flow of society and titles and egos and attachments. It might feel easy to be pulled onto those strings and to have desires. But ever easier it is not to have those desires. It only seems easy because we live in the world and we've been conditioned to think otherwise. But our natural state, our natural conditioning does not have that. It's able to master itself because everything in nature can self-govern. And so when we're following nature, and we can ask ourselves, are we following nature? Then we trust the path. And we don't fight the stream or current of life. We adjust our mind, but we don't adjust reality. We adjust our mind because this will help us change our man-made reality, our perception of reality. It helps the universe express itself so we're not fighting against it, so we're not trying to replace it or not blocking the river. And it's not just for our purpose. but the purpose of the universe, seeing beyond the subjective to see the whole with no limit or ego. Again, the difference between the two truths in Buddhism, the relative truth and the absolute truth. The Tao, and then there's you. And there's no separation between the two, except when we think there is. It's our minds that get in the way. It's our egos that get in the way. It's our perceptions that get in the way. So if we choose to be one with nature, we would allow ourselves to then be part of the flow of nature's perception, which is merely life, reality, the current, the stream, the water that Lao Tzu talks about. And so one might actually also take psychedelics for this effect. This is worth mentioning because people do. They seek that in order to attain any spiritual enlightenment, and there's many folks who talk about this online, and Terence McKenna you might know about as well. Many great talks talking about how psychedelics may have been lost in our natural society as it turned more unnatural, but you can look at his talks, you can learn from him, absolutely. But what does Alan Watts have to say about it? Well, he says if you get the message, hang up the phone. For psychedelic drugs are simply instruments, like microscopes, telescopes, and telephones. The biologist does not sit with eyes permanently glued to the microscope. He goes away and works on what he has seen. And so he's saying here not to be attached to the psychedelics. Again, you can have tools that help you. You're going to have those things that people may find undesirable. And those psychedelics, they can be marijuana, they can be mushrooms, they can be, there's a billion different ways people do this type of stuff. I personally have never done it. And that's not to say that you should never do it, and just because Alan Watts is saying if you get the message, hang up the phone, that you should do it once and never do it again. But what he's saying is that you shouldn't be dependent on it necessarily. That if you get a message from taking mushrooms, for instance, you take that message to heart and you apply it. You do something with it because the message was given to you. And you can try to stay on the phone, but that's when you might have some effects that might be unwanted. People abusing substances and drugs and not using it consciously. And so if we're conscious, we take the message, we take it to heart, we apply it, and we're not permanently glued to the microscope, just like any other tool or instrument in this life, he's saying. Okay? We use it when the time is right. This is Wu Wei. So we wouldn't be abusing its use. It's just using things more consciously and more naturally. And we do know that moderation is key, as we've talked about before. So let's bear that in mind and move forward with simplicity, frugality, humility, and compassion toward nature, toward ourselves, and therefore be careful with what we do. But also be able to be carefree in the sense of learning how to let go, and perhaps also without the substances. There's many people who might be alcohol dependent, for instance, and they need that in order to have fun. But they don't need it. They think they do. And again, their mind now gets in their own way. When they're on alcohol, they're able to let go, but why can't they let go without it? So let us not distract ourselves from our feelings and emotions with coping mechanisms. We talked about this before. We bury our emotions and traumas until they erupt. We must master our mind, balance the inner, which is intuition, flow, harmony, and outer, which is the analyzing, categorizing, and comparing being, the inner and outer being. So in thinking, keep to the simple. In conflict, be fair and generous. In governing, don't try to control. In work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. When you are content to be simply yourself and don't compare or compete, everybody will respect you. Lao Tzu. This is some really practical advice that Lao Tzu is giving us here of what to do in our own lives. So feel free to reflect upon this for yourself. Am I thinking simply? Am I fair and generous in conflict? Am I trying to control everything around me? Am I doing what I enjoy? Am I present? Am I simply myself? And do I have a balance between my inner and outer being? This is how we create a holistic life. You see the flower, picture of the flower, everything comes from the center and blooms from the center. As it is so synchronistic, we sense some sense of order with it, and throughout it also randomness. It's a beautiful phenomenon. We just can't quite get our finger on it, but we can see it to some extent. And so let us now talk about leadership, because this is a very big topic. And a lot of people who may read the Tao Te Ching might assume it is a rule book for leaders, not just for people who are everyday people. Now, Lao Tzu tells us there isn't a difference really between leaders and everyday people. There's just people, right? He talks about how the Tao is like water and it seeks the lowest places. So what then is their value in leadership? What is Lao Tzu's views on leadership? He says to us, the wise, embracing unity, will become the world's model. Not boasting, they will be praised. Not building up themselves, they will endure. As much as they embrace the world will embrace them. Peace is meant to be our natural state. Those who try to seize power and remake society will fail. One who attempts to remake it will only deface it. Radiating simplicity, wise rulers inspire others to follow their path. If people were to follow it, Tao, they would have no need of rulers. The high is always founded upon the low. Great rulers identify with orphans, inferiors, and the unworthy. Oppressive measures never achieve their intended results. Police officers and lawmakers are often the worst criminals. Those who fight do not win. Those who win do not fight. They know nothing of power, yet they are bursting with life. When people live freely and fearlessly, virtue will abound. Respond to hatred with kindness. It is the very opposite of common governing, but it is the most effective way to rule. Wise rulers, desiring to lead the people, humble themselves and stay below them. Wishing to help the people, they stay out of the way. They guide without coercion. They do not quarrel with anyone, so no one quarrels with them. Compassion leads to victory in battle and safety in defense. So, you may be able to notice that this is a compilation of a bunch of different quotes that I just put on one slide, basically going over many of the different aspects there in leadership. Now, this is also a mixture of different types of translations, because there can be some issues when we're talking about leadership when it comes to the Tao Te Ching that I've noticed. For instance, the idea of rulers or masters or leaders, these might be different things, and even Ian Withy Berry, which is another content creator that you may find online, talks about when the word ruler is used, he's actually referring to ourselves. So there's different interpretations of what is meant by ruler or leader, but even if we did take it through the context of these rulers are people in government, ask yourself if government does any of these things, and if they follow all these rules that Lao Tzu is telling us about the Tao, and simplicity, and frugality, and compassion, kindness, and humility. Ask yourself if that is followed by any government ever in history. And I'm sure there's been moments where there might have been people who want to follow leaders. But if those leaders are now higher than the other individuals, then they are present, and then that seems to contradict what Lao Tzu talks about when the leaders are supposed to be in the lower places and they don't even seem like they exist. So it's kind of confusing to some extent. We have to break this down a lot more. So let's start off with the fact that there's different types of masters. So is a master who people want to follow a master in the sense of slavery? Because many times, especially if you look at the 1800s, for instance, which is way long after Lao Tzu wrote his text, he's talking about master, and oftentimes he's talking about mastery, as in mastering your senses, mastering your thoughts, This is why, again, Ian Withy Berry talks about how the idea of ruler or master is referring to ourselves. But we have to see that the word master has clearly two different interpretations. So let's not assume that Lao Tzu is talking about a master that people should follow, but rather a master in a sense of somebody who is maybe actually masterful, somebody who's really skillful, not somebody who's saying you have to obey me like a slave master. I mean, that's totally different. Okay, so in the same way, we can say, is the leader who inspires others to voluntarily emulate their actions a ruler who is given an authority to demand compliance? They're two completely separate things, right? A leader is somebody that people really look up to and are inspired by, who maybe helps them become rulers or leaders over themselves and for others, and it's voluntary. Whereas a ruler, or again, a slave master, I mean, they are not voluntary relationships, they are imposing, they use force, so it clearly goes against Wu Wei. It clearly goes against the ideas of the path of least resistance. And so, just something to bear in mind. I mean, you can even see the pictures I chose here. I mean, on one hand, you have a master on the left, and you could have a master on the right, but the guy on the left is clearly skillful. He's a master in karate or whatever martial art he's doing. And the guy on the right, he's just wearing a fancy crown and uniform. I don't know if he's actually skillful or worth emulating. It seems like he has an identity that he built around himself. And so it's a big difference, perhaps, that I wanted to just note when we see these words, is that the word master or ruler may not be interpreted the same way everybody thinks it should be interpreted as. And so let's talk about then ruling the world. What does Lao Tzu and Zhuang Zhou, what do they have to say directly about this? Well, Lao Tzu tells us, do you want to rule the world and control it? I don't think it ever can be done. The world is a sacred vessel and it cannot be controlled. You will only make it worse if you try. It may slip through your fingers and disappear. The master does not force virtue on others, thus she is able to accomplish her task. The ordinary person who uses force will find that they accomplish nothing. Force is followed by loss of strength. This is not the way of the Tao. That which goes against the Tao comes to an early end. So he's making it really clear here, from my interpretation of this, of Lao Tzu, that force and violence is not the path of leadership or mastery. And so when we look at mastery in the sense of slave masters, or we look at leaders in the sense of rulers, I don't think that's what Lao Tzu is talking about. He's talking about an individual who is worth emulating, who is good at what they do. They don't need to use force for people to follow them. They just go with the flow of nature, and therefore they don't seek to rule the world. They don't seek a position of authority. And so Zhuangzi tells us, when he tries to extend his power over objects, those objects gain control over him. He who seeks to extend his control is nothing but an operator. While he thinks he is surpassing others, others see him merely straining, stretching to stand on tiptoe. And if you want to relate that to a previous Lao Tzu quote we talked about before, if you try to stand on a tiptoe, if you try to put yourself in the light, you're going to dim your light. You're just going to make things worse. It's counterintuitive. And so ask yourself if any government in history has ever really not used force or violence. I mean, every single law that I know of has been backed by violence. So this violates pretty much every government we've ever seen. And that supports the other quote we saw, which is that it's like a government that we've never seen before. It's never been there because, again, Lao Tzu tells us that if it does exist where somebody is aligned to the Tao, they don't exist as a ruler. They aren't present. So it seems like we have to wrap our head around this, and it seems so contradictory and weird, but it's actually so simplistic. It's coming from this position of the uncarved block that a lot of us may not be able to see. And so we can notice that there's a location of law going on. There's a difference between someone whose law is within himself versus someone whose law is outside himself. The first person acts without any need of approval or disapproval. So do you own yourself? Because if you own yourself, you've recognized this as sort of a rule for yourself, right? So why would you concern about a world out of your control? You're trying to control others, then that means you have to make rules for them, but that means then you're trying to own others or tell them how to live their own lives. And can you really do that in reality? Well, Zhuangzi, Lao Tzu, they're telling us that you can't do that. And if you try to put yourself on this elevated position, it's actually going to create a lot of downsides and problematic occurrences. So we can't help but then talk about anarchism. Because if you do research on Taoism, and I talked about this in the very beginning of the presentation, Taoism is considered among the first anarchist philosophies historically. And so don't be afraid of this term, because we're going to be looking at it under a philosophical basis. We're going to break it down and really understand what is meant when this accusation is used. But to first realize, again, the problem with titles and identities, even if this was true, we shouldn't just say, oh, well, I'm an anarchist, or I'm a Taoist, or I'm this or that, and I should be using these symbols and colors, because they stray away from the truth and the higher truth that could be seen. So just something to bear in mind when I share all this information. So from the Greek prefix an means without, the absence of, and the Greek noun archon means master or ruler. Anarchy does not mean no rules, it means no rulers. It is not a rejection of hierarchy or leaders, only involuntary hierarchies, i.e. rulers. Okay? Every time it's been used throughout history, it has been used, again in the philosophical context, specifically to mean this. No rulers, no hierarchy, in particular no involuntary hierarchy. Okay? There's different types of anarchism that people like to string onto this too. Anarcho-capitalism, anarcho-communism, anarcho this and that, and it becomes very ideological. It becomes to the point where people say, this is my identity, and they start with desires and attachments, and they bring it in to this basic idea of there's no involuntary hierarchy. And if you just go from that premises of there's no involuntary hierarchy, then there's no violence being used. Because the concept of rulers implies man-made law, or authority, or government, or the state. These are all just words to represent the same thing. So the inherent nature of law, which is violence, and inauthenticity, which is statism, people trying to be something they're not, acts against Wu Wei and the Tao. So we'll be talking about what that actually means. But the symbol for anarchy, just to throw this out there, it's an A with an O. The O actually represents order or organization. So contrary to popular belief, you might see people who are protesting with this symbol, who are causing chaos and violence, obviously against what Lao Tzu and Daoism talks about. Philosophically, it means order and organization, and the A just means anarchy, which again just means no rulers. So it doesn't mean there's no rules, and it doesn't mean people can't organize. Again, the O can represent organization as well. So let us look more into this and understand why Taoism is accused of being an anarchist philosophy. Again, not to attach ourselves to it, but to understand that Lao Tzu is actually telling us that if a world is going to self-govern itself and there's not going to be any rulers present, that Taoism is essentially an anarchist philosophy. And this will become more apparent as we look deeper into even more quotes from Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, if not the whole presentation and everything I've shared so far. This is no agenda on part of me, but simply on the nature of what Taoism is. And so anarchism tackles something called statism, and I mentioned that that is the inauthenticity of human beings trying to be something they're not. So statism is the belief that there is such a thing as authority vested in certain human beings, magically giving them the right to rule over other people. This authority means that certain people who we call government have the moral right to issue commands to those who they rule, those under their jurisdiction, and that their subjects or slaves have a moral obligation to obey the arbitrary dictates or laws set by their masters. Most simply put, a statist is someone who believes in the legitimacy of slavery. And there's even evidence of the abolitionists in the 18th century, in the 19th century as well, where they talk about this type of slavery. So this is not something that's new. It's not something that is just, again, used for agenda purposes. Statism has been talked about throughout history. Even Etienne de la Boétie, he's a French writer, wrote a whole book about this called The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. And it's a fantastic read and has many quotes about being in harmony with nature and allowing nature's laws to rule. And so that aligns very much with Taoist teachings. But instead of me telling you what anarchy is and what statism is, and statism seen as this bad thing because it's inauthenticity of human beings and who we naturally are, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Number one, is there any means by which any number of individuals can delegate to someone else the moral right to do something which none of the individuals have the moral right to do themselves? So if you don't have the right to steal from others, can you give that right that you don't have to other people? Say government, authority figures, policemen, they're allowed to rob from others, but you're not because they're an authority figure. Is morality not universally applied? Is the golden rule now able to be broken? So then let's look at number two. Do those who wield political power, presidents, legislators, etc., have the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do? If so, from whom and how do they acquire such a right? So if you say, yeah, well, they can steal for this or for that, you are now allowing theft, and not to mention you're guaranteeing it to prevent possible theft or possible problems for your own whim. You're controlling other people that you do not control, and you are giving people power, putting them up on a pedestal over other human beings as well. You create a lot of really tense, chaotic scenarios that wouldn't have happened in nature, that wouldn't be naturally there, per se. And so if you give people the moral right to do things which other people do not have the moral right to do, it's quite contradictory because we're all human beings, are we not? So unless you're saying we're not equal and that we each have different rights, then you're saying that some people have the right to rule and some people have the right to steal. Well, then what gives them the right to steal? What gives them the right to rule? Other than your mere belief, it has to be statism. Number three, is there any process, constitutions, elections, legislation, by which human beings can transform an immoral act into a moral act without changing the act itself? Can you do that? Can you turn a theft or murder into something that's right? Say, oh, well, no, theft is okay if it's in this scenario, if it's in that scenario, if it's for the greater good. Or are you going to say theft is always wrong, no matter what? Because it is. You know, even if we can recognize it teaches us of what is right, that's the whole point of why we would recognize it as wrong, right? So we can not see it necessarily as wrong, but as part of life, as in Taoism. But at the same time, we're not going to continue it because it's force. It goes against Wu Wei. It's trying to change human beings and make them good, but we cannot do that. And so number four, when lawmakers and law enforcers use coercion and force in the name of law and government, do they bear the same responsibility for their actions that anyone else would who did the same thing on their own? You really have to think about these questions for yourself because, I'll be honest, this programming goes back to our very childhood. When we grow up in this world and wherever country you're in, you think your country is one that you have to be proud of and you have to pledge allegiance to a flag or worship some pieces of paper. But is that honest? Is that natural for your condition? You know, did Lao Tzu ever say, yeah, you know, there's human authority in people and they must be followed no matter what? Confucius might have said, yeah, there need to be rules and rituals in society, but did Lao Tzu tell us that? Confucius got his way in China. Look what happened. Lao Tzu, on the other hand, left China because he saw it was heading in that direction. He saw that the world was getting more ideological and agenda-based. And Jason Gregory, which is one of the reasons why I love his videos, is he's very open and speaks up about this. He's not shy away from it. He says, hey, you know, if you want to live in harmony with nature and let things be, we can't have an agenda. We can't tell people how to live their lives. And so when there is a conflict between an individual's own moral conscience and the commands of a political authority, is the individual morally obligated to do what he personally views as wrong in order to obey the law? Should he go against what he knows to be wrong just because someone told him to do so? This would be going against our own intuition and what we know. Again, Wu Wei is intelligent effortlessness and going with the stream of life, not the stream of society. Not having all these desires and attachments and letting them take hold of us and just doing what we're told. No, acting intelligently and acting only when necessary. So just ask yourself these questions and think for yourself. Here's more understanding that we can get from this point of view. If we had our needs met and were content with who we are, we would be ungovernable. What works today will not work tomorrow. There will always be change naturally. So when we try to pass a law, it's not universal and it's temporary, and it's just some opinions of some people of what they think should be done upon the rest of society. So apply that in light of our knowledge of the Tao. Does that really stand at the test of time? Is that challenging the Tao? Well, we don't need to force change. We cannot alter nature based on belief systems or social conformity. We try to force the enforceable, but we can't make people good. Lao Tzu, remember, he tells us, let reality be reality. We are told that nature is chaotic, and thus we think we should try to control everything. And so every government always falls and never sustains. And it rises again because people still have that statist belief system, which is actually quite simple. It's not so complex. It's simply that belief in authority, that other people have the right to rule, that you can put people on this pedestal and they can do things that other people can't do. It's contradictory to our own morals and our own beliefs. And so Taoism teaches us that everything in nature will govern itself and that nature always gets its way. So why do we try and keep attempting to create new governments thinking that we've got it figured out? Sometimes we'll even say that the government was created by God and it's perfect and it will keep itself limited, but it never does. Perhaps it's because it's the nature of such a system that it cannot do so. And it's not the first time, again, that we've recognized this. And I'm going to be sharing with you a lot more information about this, even from Chinese Taoists throughout history that share this exact perspective. And so without government, who would provide blank, right? Many people ask this question, well, who would provide roads? Well, who will, fix this problem, that problem, whatever comes on people's mind arbitrarily. And so if I ask you, is it important for what you think government would provide? And if you say no, well, then the government shouldn't be wasting money on things that aren't important. But if you say, yes, it's important, well, would you be willing to pay for it even if you weren't forced to do so? And if you say yes, well, then people would pay for it voluntarily. And if you say no, then I have to go back to the question, is it important? Because if it's important enough, people will pay voluntarily, just as they do any other service in society. The only exemption people make to their basic morality is with statism and in politics. And if we understand this may be able to help us align to Taoism in more ways than we may understand. Because as far as I'm aware right now, and I'm making this presentation, a lot of Taoists do not know this perspective of their own philosophy about anarchism, about authority, and the concept of human authority, if that's even a thing. And so look at the position of voluntarism on the chart on the right. So if you look at communism, socialism, conservatism, even minarchism is the idea that the government should be very small and limited, and it will be perfect if it's just balanced enough to work in such a way. Notice that it still includes using violence on peaceful people in order to get certain things done. And the only one that doesn't is voluntarism, which is just a simple moral philosophy that says, I am not willing to use violence against peaceful people. I will seek to acquire desired services through voluntary relationships. It is embracing the reality that people will always trade with each other, that there will always be some sort of fruits of people's labor, that people will need to work for what they want or trade and develop businesses and organizations, that is just part of our nature, to organize, to do everything that we do. But it's not part of our nature to think that somebody is an authority figure who must rule over our lives, who must use violence in everybody else that we disagree with, because, we think that authority figure is the best and should rule over everyone else, or we think we should rule over everyone else. I mean, it's absurd. We get that idea because we were programmed into it purely and only because of that. And I will share more as to why that is, and I can say so without a doubt. Statism requires force. Voluntarism requires virtue. Statism divides people into controllable groups, whereas voluntarism leaves people free to associate. Statism encourages envy, whereas voluntarism encourages wise decision-making. Statism rewards loyalty to the state, whereas voluntarism rewards loyalty to hard work. Statism destroys success, whereas voluntarism rewards success. Statism seeks to control others, and voluntarism seeks to keep others from controlling you. And you can just look at a mere example of raw milk, how it's illegal in a lot of states in America. It's a healing food that's been consumed for thousands of years. It's illegal because some people think it's unhealthy or it's going to cause disease, but do not people have the right to their own body to decide what to put in it or not? If they have the right to decide what to put in their own body because they own their own body, then it doesn't matter what someone says that they can or cannot do with their own body because it's their own body. And so as long as they don't transgress on other people's bodies, fair enough, it's the golden rule. It's voluntarism. It's voluntary. And so voluntarism offers limitless options. Statism limits your options, and it results in suffering, whereas voluntarism results in freedom, inevitably, because it is. And you can just see these other charts sum it up quite well. We were all humans until race disconnected us, politics divided us, religion separated us, and wealth classified us. Again, Taoism would look at all of these polarities and say, these are all man-made attachments and desires holding humans in place and preventing us from flowing with the natural universe at hand. Plato, Western philosopher, tells us good people don't need laws to tell them to act responsibly, and bad people will find a way around the laws. So what's the point of the law? Larkin Rose really helps summarize this concept of authority in his works. He has many videos online, many great animations, even movies. Awesome stuff. He says, I'm not scared of the Maos and the Stalins and the Hitlers. I'm scared of the thousands of millions of people that hallucinate them to be authority, and so do their bidding and pay for their empires and carry out their orders. I don't care if there's one loony with a stupid mustache. He's not a threat if the people do not believe in authority. He also says government itself does no harm because it is a fictional entity. But the belief in government, the notion that some people actually have the moral right to rule over others, has caused immeasurable pain and suffering, injustice and oppression, enslavement and death. And again, all you have to do is open up any textbook, read history, and you'll see this has been the case. So why do we think we can create an exception to that? To the reality that we cannot rule over this universe or attempt to play God and rule over other people's lives. Here are just some of the examples of the silly things governments make people do. 125 years ago, you didn't have to ask permission from the government to collect rainwater, go fishing, own a property, start a business, build a home, get married, hunt, own a weapon, cut hair, sell a product, protest, or sell food. You can do virtually nothing without being extorted by government and obtaining their permission first. If you still think you're free, you're deluding yourself. You are just a free-range human living on a tax farm. Now, you may say this part of the presentation is getting a little bit more doom and gloom, but we have to face our problems. We don't escape them. We recognize that these problems are part of the process of life because they are. We experimented, and guess what? Our experiment did not work. If we want to learn from history and not repeat history, we will understand this. And so, here are more examples. Just don't feed the homeless. Don't expose secrets. You must use licenses and permits. You're required to register your birth. You must join the army if needed. You can't collect rainwater. You must use money. You're required to use a passport to travel. You must send your kids to school. You must keep all your bills and receipts. You must not grow certain plants. You must pay 20 to 40% of your income to the government, to people you don't know, for services you may not even know get done. Mandatory vaccines to participate. You must pay money for higher education. You can't drink raw milk. I mentioned that. You can't actually say what you want. Break any rules and you will pay or be locked up in a cage. Now go to school, get a job, get married, get a mortgage. Consume, obey, and die. And again, life is so much more than that. Why are we trying to limit the possibility and freedom and the potential of humans to gather together? I ask people, I do interviews in the street, and I ask them, I say, what is it you want in the world? And everybody says kindness. They say, why can't the world be more kind? And everybody's saying that. And there's a small few exception of people they recognize do bad things, but because of that small exception, we have to force extort all of society and put it all under lockdown just because of some 1-2 problems that we recognize are in the millions of generally peaceful people who understand what is right and wrong generally and don't even need to be taught it because it's become part of their intuition effortlessly as Wu Wei. What is right and wrong generally, as, do not harm others, the golden rule, and all the things I mentioned before. And so you can understand this through a psychological perspective too. There's no end to this perspective. Controllers, abusers, and manipulative people don't question themselves. They don't ask themselves if the problem is them. They always say the problem is someone else. Politics is greatly dividing, and people do this. They defend their ideology. They have this reinforcement with other people who agree with them. In politics, it's always this party's fault, that guy's fault. And it's a never-ending battle. And you saw it not long after America's foundation. The abolitionists started to see it, not even 100 years after. And now we're 300 years after. And the government has grown even more exponentially in power. And you can see this graph in the top right. How to solve all problems. Robot uprising? Well, give the government more power. Pandemic? Give the government more power. Crocs? Give the government more power. Starbucks gets your order wrong? Give the government more power. People disagreeing with you? Give the government more power. Orc invasion? Give the government more power. This is what it's getting down to. People don't want to be responsible for themselves. They want to give it away to others because they have a hard time being honest with themselves and accepting their natural reality. And again, they've been programmed into thinking that the government is like this mommy or daddy, the daddy that will protect them, or the mommy that will give them everything they need as like a caretaker figure. And so psychologically, the government works upon the populace in subtle ways like that. Even with Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon in which hostages express empathy and have positive feelings towards their captors, sometimes to the point of defending them. We're so conditioned to the point where we think we need to steal from the public in order to have services, in order to have good things in the world. We need to guarantee something wrong. And it's saying that we need something evil for the possibility of something good. Just think about how contradictory that sounds. Democide, it's the murder of any person or people by a government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder. It's actually known as the #1 cause of unnatural death. a total of nearly 400 million deaths in the 20th century. That's not even counting the 350 plus wars between governments, the 40 plus million war deaths. I mean, it's so crazy, right? This is when we have to face, yes, this is the man-made reality that we built for ourselves, but it's not the natural reality. We have to remember that. When the government does it, it's the Patriot Act. When anyone else does it, felony wiretapping. And just go through the list, you know? When government does it, it's education. When anyone else does it, indoctrination. When the government does it, arrests. When anyone else does it, kidnapping. When the government does it, taxation. When anyone else does it, armed robbery. Are we going to keep living with this clearly contradictive logic? Larkin Rose tells us, if you personally advocate that I be caged if I don't pay for whatever government things you want, please don't pretend to be tolerant or nonviolent or enlightened or compassionate. Don't pretend you believe in live and let live, and don't pretend you want peace, freedom, or harmony. This is also related to the idea that Carl Jung talks about with mass psychosis, and he also has many quotes talking about how people view the state as God and worship it, and how it alienates individuals into collective mindsets that ultimately tear apart the nation and causes chaos. He talks about that in his last book, The Undiscovered Self, but he talks about a mass psychosis is an epidemic of madness, and it occurs when a large population of society loses touch with reality and descends into delusions. He says it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man. For the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. So he's saying psychic epidemics are infinitely more devastating. What people believe, what's in their minds. And again, we talked all throughout this presentation about how our minds get in our own way, how they prevent us from aligning to our own nature. So, I mean, just look again through history. We can even create a chart, like this chart from Art of Liberty. They have a ton of great resources on their website documenting so much. And they go through how people worship the flag. They're taught to do the Pledge of Allegiance. And all these tyrannical countries all had constitutions. They all had the same monetary systems as the ones now. This worries me. The same exact strategies that these countries used, and all their citizens were like, yeah, this is great, and we love Hitler, we love Stalin. It's all this like idols and falling in love and putting them on pedestals and saying these people are going to save us from our problems. And then it descends into madness, into chaos, and it causes so much chaos that it becomes the number one cause of death. I mean, this is just mind-blowing. I don't know how to share this with the world at a certain point. Here's a really simple way to understand this whole concept of statism and the problem with authority. If John told you that you had to obey him or he would violate you, that would be wrong. So even if John claims that because he and his friends are in the majority, you must obey or be punished, that would still be wrong. Even if John and his friends vote to have an institution work on their behalf and that you must obey its dictates or be punished, that would still be wrong. So if you understand this basic concept, then you understand that government neither has the legitimate or lawful right to violate you just because some people decided to vote for it. And you can even see that all the arguments used against abolishing slavery are virtually the same for that of abolishing government. Again, not a newly found connection. We'll talk more about that too, but I also wrote many books and have many videos on that topic to be exact. And so you can see a thumbnail of a video on the top left of this slide about abolitionist towns if you want some inspiration to get out of this mess. The abolitionists in the 1800s, I consider them rather successful for what they had to do, which is end chattel slavery after thousands of years, a practice of brutality, having to convince the world that no, it is not economically good for society. and that it's okay to free slaves. It's not going to result in chaos. It's going to result, if anything, in more productivity. And it did. Yes, there's short-term chaos that happened because of, a new change in society after thousands of years, but eventually it even spread to the rest of the world because the ideas were irresistible, and people saw it that it was destined for the human race to be free. That is how the abolitionists really were able to convey their message. They even built towns to help runaway slaves, called the Underground Railroad, that would allow people to stay with them, to get away from the government, to get away from their slave masters, and be able to live more freely. And so there was one town that literally went 13 years with no government, and yet there was no crime. I believe the one particularly being noted there is called Modern Times by Josiah Warren, and he's known as the practical anarchist. He's also an abolitionist throughout history, an orchestra leader, inventor. Great guy, right? A lot of fantastic quotes from his works, and there's a lot of other abolitionists at that time. He was particularly an anarchist as well. Although, again, he's wearing a bow tie, he dresses very nicely, you wouldn't think of him as an anarchist, the same way you would look at someone like Murray Rothbard. Or even, like I show on this slide, J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the writer of the Lord of the Rings series, which is greatly popular around the world. He says, "My political opinions lean more and more to anarchy. The most improper job of any man, even saints, is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." And that was taken particularly from his own letters that he sent to his son. You can find those online. I also did a video on psychological experiments, in particular band psychology experiments that are not able to be reproduced because of how controversial the foundings were. In particular, the Stanley Milgram experiment and the Stanford Prison experiment. The Stanley Milgram experiment, definitely something you should probably look up because it tells you exactly this mentality of statism as well, where somebody is willing to compromise their own morals because they're told to do so by an authority figure. They believe in it so much. And there were many experiments, and this was redone many times, and I compiled it a lot in that documentary of all the footage because it was recorded as well. And there were books written about it too, Obedience to Authority by Stanley Milgram. And it's just shocking. Over 90% of people would conform to authority. And for the few people who didn't, they said, this is why Nazi Germany, this is why Soviet Russia did what they did. And the person who did that experiment, Stanley Milgram, said that if today America had camps, the same thing would happen, just as in Germany, because people believe in authority that much. To this day. So it hasn't changed. That's really alarming. And that should make everybody want to hopefully educate people about these ideas. But as we understand Taoism, we don't want to push ourselves too much out there. We don't want to have extreme views in a sense. But is it really extreme to tell people to simply be people? To respect people as merely people, not to see them as authority, not to see anyone higher or lesser than anyone else. It's not extreme. It seems extreme. Especially when we're new coming to it. It's really simple, actually. And so you can see if we're trying to create a better world, well, we can choose the nonviolent path. Again, the path of least resistance, Wu Wei. This is how we're actually going to achieve peace. Because if we go to submission, we have loss, and that, it's based on survival. And if we have aggression, we have gain, but that's based on instinct. So the mid-ground between submission and aggression and survival and instinct is peace, which is non-violence. We don't want to be stuck in fear. Okay, we want to be stuck in love, which doesn't have us stuck. It has us ever expansive. It has us welcoming to our fellow man. Being willing to accept their difference in opinion. Okay, that is harmony. That is voluntarism. You live the life you want to live. I leave you alone. You leave me alone. That's it. We each live our own lives with our own opinions. We just don't impose it on each other with violence. It's so simple. And so there is no necessary evil. You cannot balance what is unnatural to exist, as it may simply be abolished, as in the case of abolitionism. There is a reason why we would call something bad or unnatural. So why would we call anything a necessary evil or a natural unnatural? Chattel slavery was deemed unnatural for humankind, and we see that we can naturally live without it. It's more effortless to just live our own lives, not try to chain up other human beings and tell them, you have to work for me. That took a lot of work to maintain. It's way more effortless to live our own lives and let people pursue their own dreams. And it's way more prosperous for everybody. A poisonous plant, although it may be natural to exist, would not be something natural to use, as we recognize its nature as poisonous to our nature. So an attempt to balance government would be counterintuitive if we cannot balance something that should not exist in the first place. It has no existence other than through our belief in statism, similar to our belief that anyone must be enslaved. Okay? It's purely in the mind, and that's why it can be abolished. It can be a lost, history of humanity, putting it behind us, going to the future. Let's actually create a unified, voluntary world. That's the world that I want to create. Now, unified in the sense of people are still different among each other, but they accept that difference, and therefore they're unified. That's the type of unity I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, you have no choice but to abide to this person, okay, and no choice but to go along with what they say. That's not unity. That's using violence to force your way upon the world. I'm talking about acceptance of the differences, allowing people to live their own lives. So here's another story that Zhuangzi shares with us. He was fishing, relaxing at a riverbank. Two individuals approach him and offer to him a position and power. He observes the river's motion and states that a turtle is taken away from his natural habitat and draped in silk, enshrined for the royal palace. But which condition is preferable? Well-being tells us the natural habitat. Quote, "When all men do not carry their nature beyond its normal condition, nor alter its characteristics, the good government of the world is secured." Zhuangzi. So he's saying the better life for the turtle is being in nature, not being enshrined and for the royal palace and seen as this symbol for the world that has to be worshipped. No. So the same thing for him. He basically is declining the position of power in a clever way here by saying, well, look at nature. They're not creating governments and religions and going to war with their own species with nuclear bombs. They're not mad enough to do that. They might have some small quarrels among themselves. That's always going to exist. But they're not going to go out of their way to destroy their own species across the world at best. I mean, goodness. Us humans, we do a lot of crazy things that we can look back at the past and say, man, we burned witches. Well, we got over that because we believed in witches. Well, we don't have to believe in authority. There's no such thing. There's just human beings. And so it's about having principles. C.S. Lewis talks to us about this. I am very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside traditional morality, or Tao, and attained power, has used that power benevolently. And bear in mind that C.S. Lewis is somebody who comes from more of a Western point of view, a Christian point of view. And Jesus is an example of someone who followed the Tao and got punished for it. Jason Gregory, in his video, Why a Taoist is a Threat to Society, explains that someone who follows the Tao can't follow societal norms and dogmas. Taoism teaches us that we are interfering with our nature. We live in fear instead of trust, so we try to create goals and controls. Every ideology tries to shape individuals. We need to be able to say no and live with principles to live by, not man-made standards. Lao Tzu was a rebel to the mainstream Confucianism in China, and he's straight up left. He's a rebel. He's an anarchist to that system. He didn't do so with violence. I'm going to go to the state. No, he just left. Now it's not so easy nowadays. People tell me, well, if you don't like it here, why don't you leave? this is my natural universe. And not to mention, they watch you everywhere, and there's basically nowhere you can escape nowadays. But that being said, why can't I live where I naturally reside? In nature, actually naturalized. Not as a citizen, but as a human being. In nature, natural eyes to make natural. I don't see why this can't be the case. It's only people's beliefs that are holding other people back from living their lives. So if we deconstruct this one belief, which, by the way, barely anyone talks about, as much as when I'm making this video, then, we can really expect a change in the world, because most people never even heard of statism or voluntarism. At least this is, from my point of view, of how I look at it. Even just Daoism has always been sort of like the undercurrent of society, but it's still always rising here and there again and again. And I think it's because it has some of these similar themes to voluntarism, and understanding this basic concept of we need to align to nature, not man-made politics, not man-made religions, not man-made systems of control. Nature has been there. It's always been there, right? And so there are no lesser evils. Lao Tzu tells us the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when good things are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. Lao Tzu. So choosing the path of least resistance is not picking between two evils. It is not participating at all, and therefore nourishing both evils in the light of the Tao. People think they have to choose a lesser of greater evil, but then that means they're still picking evil. They have a third choice. The third choice is do not vote, do not participate. Simply live your life. So whether you're looking at democracy or a republic, and Republicans or republics are telling you, we're not a democracy, it doesn't matter. It's still a system of control. It's an ideology telling human beings how to live their own life. So if we want to get out of that, it's about seeing this Taoist perspective, returning to our uncarved block, and seeing we're all just human beings. And that's all just made up from people long ago we didn't even know, most of them being slave owners too. And a lot of shady practices happened back then as well that can also be documented. But, people will always ask the question, well, what about law and order? Lao Tzu tells us the more laws and restrictions there are, the poorer people become. The sharper men's weapons, the more trouble in the land. The more ingenious and clever men are, the more strange things happen. The more rules and regulations, the more thieves and robbers. So, you can just look at that picture. It's like, tell me what in there is natural, other than the fact that they're human beings, but they're trying to be something they're not. They're all wearing special wigs and outfits and trying to have some sort of position of identity and authority over others. And you can see probably some conflict arises between the members, and they're deciding the fate for the rest of the world. These group of individuals over millions of other people. Just to think of that alone, like a select few people over millions of people, or one person over millions of people. Does that make sense to you? It doesn't to me personally, but, again, think for yourself on this matter. Here's another story from Zhuangzi. I don't actually know how to say this guy's name, but I'm going to butcher this. Sui Qi said to Lao Tzu, "You say there must be no government, but if there is no government, how are men's hearts to be improved?" "The last thing you should do," said Lao Tzu, "is to tamper with men's hearts. The heart of man is like a spring. If you press it down, it only springs up the higher. It can be hot as the fiercest fire, cold as the hardest ice. So swift is it that in the space of a nod, it can go twice to the end of the world and back again. In repose, it is quiet as the bed at a pool. In action, mysterious as heaven. A wild steed that cannot be tethered, such is the heart of man." From Zhuangzi. So this is another story telling us, again, that the world is not meant to be governed by other men, other human beings. And Alan Watts even helps us put this into perspective. He says, quote, "You're only making a mess by trying to put things straight. You're trying to straighten out a wiggly world, and no wonder you're in trouble. And quite literally, we can observe the wiggly world in nature. Li in Chinese is considered organic pattern, but it's also considered law or order. It's the wiggly world which can be observed throughout nature. And here are just a bunch of different photos of different patterns within nature. I remember just going into the ocean the other day and seeing the pattern of the ripples of the waves. I mean, you can say it's a pattern, but each one, it's not the same, but it's relatively similar. It's like an order, you can't really put your finger on. And I looked at seaweed. I pulled up seaweed out of the ocean. I'm like, wow, this has like a brick-like structure to it. It's so fascinating, right? That there's this order and randomness within the universe at once together. It's so amazing. So Lao Tzu tells us the strong wind cannot last the whole morning. The torrential rain cannot last all day. It is nature that causes these things. But even nature cannot cause them to go on forever. If nature cannot do this, then certainly man cannot do so. The wise person follows the laws of earth. Soldiers are weapons of evil. Well, those are two separate quotes there, but they're both from Lao Tzu. And, I love that one where he says, the wise person follows the laws of earth. I mean, most people, when they hear the word law, they only have one definition. And, Mark Passio, he teaches a concept called natural law, very much related to that. Again, we also talked about deism, which shares that same idea. So he's saying if nature cannot do this, then certainly man cannot do so. Trying to make something last forever, like a government. Trying to make a law be perfect. It's not going to be perfect. So do we expect humans to always just be on top of it all the time and constantly be putting in new laws and taking them out? I mean, it's a stressful pursuit. Most of the people I talk to in those fields, they don't even want to do it themselves. Oh, I feel obligated to. I got to run for the people. They're doing what they don't want to do. Is this the life that people should be living? People should follow perhaps what is forever, what is nature itself. You see this kid surrendering into nature, into God, into the laws of earth, whatever you want to see it as, to the real government of the world. It has its own laws, thermodynamics, gravity, or whatever you want to call it, morality, right? The Tao. That is what we can embrace because it's all here for all of us, not just some select portion of humanity. Not for some people's ideas and ideologies so they can also have a paycheck with it. I think it's absurd. And hopefully coming from the uncarved block perspective, you can see this and it becomes simple as I see it. I see it so simply because I've done that shadow work. I've cried having to get over that belief system for myself. I couldn't wrap my head around it for the longest time. I mean, and I'm a young person, and I can expect it to be much harder for somebody who's 40, 50, 60 years old, going through this belief system so long into their life, statism. This is why Larkin Rose calls it the most dangerous superstition. And this is his book, The Most Dangerous Superstition. And you know what he says in it? He says, anarchy is reality. There's a whole section dedicated to it. So this is just one part of that section, okay? It's a fantastic book, perhaps the most underrated book of our times, and I think it will stand the test of time, just as the Tao Te Ching does. He says, many people have become anarchists, advocates of a society without any ruling class after having to come to the conclusion that society would be more prosperous and more peaceful and would enjoy more justice and security without any government at all. However, that is somewhat akin to an individual deciding, after careful analysis, that Christmas would work better without Santa Claus. But if Santa Claus is not real, it is pointless to have a debate about whether he is needed in order for Christmas to work. If Christmas works at all, it already works without Santa. And so it is with the usual debate between government and anarchy. Government does not exist. And this is a shared perspective among this voluntarist community that simply wants to see nature as nature and allow human beings to do what they've always done, which is trade with each other voluntarily without this superstition that has been indoctrinated into us at a very young age through the public schooling system. And so he even shares with us about the absence of rulers. He says, anarchy, meaning an absence of government, is what is. It is what has always been and will always be. When people accept that truth and stop hallucinating a creature called authority, they will stop behaving in the irrational and destructive manner they do now. People cannot delegate rights they do not have, which makes it impossible for anyone to acquire the right to rule, i.e. authority. People cannot alter morality, which makes the laws of government devoid of any inherent authority. A human being cannot have superhuman rights, and therefore no one can have the inherent right to rule. A person cannot be morally obliged to ignore his own moral judgment. Therefore, no one can have the inherent obligation to obey another. And those two ingredients, the ruler's right to command and the subject's obligation to obey, are the heart and soul of the concept of authority, without which it cannot exist. So that's it. Two ingredients, the subject obeying and the ruler's right to rule, which again comes from the person that gives them that right, which is statists, the belief in authority, statism in particular. I like to focus on the idea. I don't like to go around saying to people, you're a statist or you're an anarchist. I don't like to do that. I like to stay very focused on the ideas and the beliefs, what's actually going on. There's a reason why it is referred to as the most dangerous religion, okay? And so here's another book that reaffirms this, and this is also very simply put. I mean, you're talking, I think kids can read this just like the Tao Te Ching. It is very simplistic, yet very powerful. I think we shared a quote from this before, The End of All Evil by Jeremy Locke. He explains to us, there is no such thing as anarchy. You will not kill your neighbor in the absence of police. You are not evil. Those who wish this type of control and violence over others teach you that you are not worthy of ruling yourself. In fact, they're inciting chaos a lot of the time. They're putting in societal programmings. They're making it worse so they can validate their own existence. They teach you that you lack intelligence, self-control, and value. They teach that only government can rule you. The word government means tyranny. It exists to establish ownership of you. You need no governing. You are a human being and as such have infinite worth. You and you alone rightfully control your actions, your speech, and your labor. All who seek these things of you must receive your permission first. All who do not are evil. Anarchy is a lie. It is created by tyrants to deceive you. There is no such thing as anarchy. There is only tyranny. And again, it's just another way of saying anarchy is simply nature then. And this is another shared perspective among many other writers I can share with you. I can go on all day, but you get the point. What is being emphasized here is that voluntary interaction is superior to violent interaction, and most people know this. So let us go by what we know and act intelligently and do not act in the case of government. Wu Wei, non-action. Let's deliberately choose not to create the existence of government because it doesn't exist in reality. We want to go with the flow of life, not the flow of some system that is built to control us. That is not a system that we want in our lives if it's just always going to end up in chaos and the most amount of death. That is way more than any private murderers can ever do on their own, and this has also been statistically proven. So thank you very much for watching. This is the end of part 4. We have a lot more to share and a lot more evidence of a lot of what I shared throughout this entire presentation. We're going to be concluding in the final part for part 5. Thank you very much for sticking around as long as you have. Take care.